Hey everybody, welcome to this video on getting started with data. So as you know from our discussions in class, we have a pretty large data set that we're going to be working with for the hat for this class. And many of you also work with pretty large data sets in your own organizations. What we're going to do with this data set that we have is we're going to start to clean it up. Whether you have a large data set or a small data set, what's really important is that you first clean the data, you scrub the data, okay? So we're gonna go through in this video a couple of processes that will help you to do that. So in the first part of the video, we're gonna create what's called a data glossary. So I'm gonna ask you to create a separate Word document that will help you track the way that you're transforming some of your variables, okay? The next thing that we're gonna do in that first segment is we're gonna do what's called dummy coding. So as I've described before, quantitative data has everything to do with numbers, right? But a lot of variables that we use are not necessarily numbers. They are categories, right? So think about full-time or part-time status, for example. As an employee, you can be full-time or part-time. That's not really a number category, right? So we have to change it to a number category so we can do statistical analyses using that data, okay? In the second part of the video, you're going to be computing some new variables, all right? So in the data set, as we've talked about, you have a lot of numbers that are in front of you. And so one of the things that we'll do is we'll try to condense that down into a manageable amount of information that we'll have, okay? Now, we're not going to get rid of the other pieces of information. We're just going to we're going to hide that. So that's the other thing that I'm going to show you how to do, is to hide some of those columns so that you can better manage some of this information. Okay, so that's what we'll do in the second part of the video. And then the last thing that I'm going to ask you to do is to export the file as a CSV file. So we're going to be using two statistical softwares in this class. Excel, which does some pretty basic stuff, and it can work for most scenarios. We're going to be using another statistical software that's free. It's open source, and you can do some pretty robust statistics with that, but it does require that your data set be in a usable format, and Excel is not a usable format for that software, okay? So again, just to recap, you're going to build a data glossary, you're going to be doing some dummy coding, you're going to be computing new variables, you're going to be hiding some of the columns so you can make everything a bit more manageable, and then you're going to be saving your file as a CSV file, and you'll do that for both the original file as well as the edited file that you end up with at the end. Enjoy! In the first part of working with a data set, one of the things that you're going to want to do is to clean up the data set. So we're going to do that together in this short video using the data set that we have provided in Blackboard. So actually, one of the first things that you'll want to do is to convert a lot of these this information that you have here in these columns. You'll want to convert that to numbers, and that'll be important when it comes to some of the analyses that we'll do a little bit later on. Not all of them, but some of them. So actually, what I want to do first is I want you to save two versions of this data file. I want you to have a version of this data set that is exactly like the original, it's just like this. And then I want you to have one that is edited. So what you might want to do first is you might want to just go and do a quick save as, and create a new file. Just maybe unedited, something up here, something like that. So I'm not going to do that because I don't need to on this computer, but that's what I want you to do first. So again, you'll have two copies. You'll have one copy that is just the original, and then we'll have this copy that you're going to work with. So again, one of the things that we need to do is we need to take this information that is not in numerical format, some of it, and we need to change it into a numerical format. So you'll see that one of these is done for you already. You see this column that says plant is actually already listed by number. So plant number 1, plant number 2, plant number 3 and 4, and so on and so forth, all the way down to number 13. So what could have been in there instead would be, for example, plant number 1, Louisville, Kentucky. It could have said Louisville, Kentucky all the way down this column. We would still want to change it to a number, but that's already done for you, so we don't really have to worry about that. However, when it comes to these other categories, we do want to go ahead and change them to numbers. And this process is called dummy coding. So dummy coding is essentially the act of taking what is known as a categorical variable and changing it to a number. Okay. Now, in order to not confuse yourself, one thing that most people always do when you're dealing with data like this is you create what's called a glossary or a code book or a guidebook, but typically a data glossary. So what you'll want to do is you'll want to open a Word document and you'll want to create a table, just a simple table. So we'll just insert a simple table here, and you can make this table however you want to make it. But essentially what you're going to do is, let's start with gender, for example. So we're going to put gender here. We're going to say female, male, and then our final response was, let's go back to the data set and see, choose not to respond. Okay, so we're going to put choose not to respond as our third category. Choose not to respond. Okay, now what we're going to do is make sure that we keep track of all of these numbers by listing that in our glossary. Okay, so typically just a couple things you might think about when we're doing dummy coding. The numbers, the actual numbers that you use, are not really that important. What is important is that you keep track of exactly what those numbers are, though. So for example, you could use a 1 here, a 2 here, and a 3 here. You could do 2, 4, 6. You could do whatever. But it's important that you just keep track of these numbers, and the simplest way to do this is, again, just to start with 1. Some people, when they're doing this kind of dummy coding, they might start with 0 and do 1 and 2. That's okay. You are able to do that, but typically if we start to do things like correlations and that sort of stuff, it's just kind of easier to have numbers that are not 0. So again, you'll want to do this with all of your categorical variables over here in this spreadsheet. So I'm going to show you the one column here, the gender column, and we'll play with that. Okay, so again, you have your glossary here. So this is what we're going to use. Okay, so we won't try not to forget that. Now, when it comes to these other categories, again, you'll just want to maybe do it maybe alphabetically. That's okay. Do it alphabetically. For age, that's probably makes most sense if you start with the youngest age. So it looks like 20 to 24 is the youngest age, and then the next one would be 25 to 29, and then what would we have? 30 to 34, I guess we would have. I don't see it. Yeah, right here. So anyway, you would just go up in sequence like that. But for something like gender, race, plant, job status, those don't really, those are nominal categories. They are nominal categorical variables, so we don't really have a sequence to them. So going by alphabetical order is fine to do that. So now what I'm going to show you, the way that I convert these to numbers, is just the way I do it. There are other ways to do it. There's actually formulas that you can use in Excel to do it, but this is the way that I find is typically the easiest to do. So what I'll do is I'll just do a find and replace. There's also other kinds of software that will do this in a more sophisticated way, but honestly, with the data that we're working with, this is just the easiest way to do it. So I'm just going to go to Edit, Find, Replace, and you see I've already been kind of playing with this a little bit. So what I'll do first is let's do female, replace with. Now let's go back to our data sheet and just double check. So female is being replaced with 1. So replace with 1. And I'll do replace, and you'll see that, okay, great. So it's this first one up here has been changed. So you now see participant 1 has now had gender changed from female to 1. Okay, so that's great. Now we could click this over and over again, but if we just hit replace all, it just does it all for us automatically. So great, that's wonderful. Now since we have this up, we'll just go ahead and do male. So male, again, if we look over here, is 2. So we'll replace male with 2. Hit replace all. Great. Done. And then we'll say choose not to respond. Now, one tip for you when you're doing this, when you type this into the find, the selection right here, you have to type it exactly as it is. One way that you could actually do this is you could actually just copy and paste what's in your sheet and put it here. So let me just close this and I'll give you an example. So the first time I was working with this data set, I actually wrote choose not to answer or something like that. It said, oh, we couldn't find this. So I was like, oh gosh, well, what did I do wrong? So I can just come in here. I can select this information, hit Control C for copy, go back to Edit, Find, Replace, select this, Control V for paste, and replace with 3. Hit Replace All. Something's not working. I bet it's because I have something selected. Okay, let's try this again. Edit, Find, Replace, Replace All. Okay, so we're good. So we'll close that, and so that took care of our gender category. Now, for these other ones, again, you'll just want to go back to your data glossary and fill that in. I would fill this in first as you go, just so you don't get confused, and just make sure that you're touching on all of these categories. So, for example, you'll do full-time as, say, 1 and part-time as 2. So, again, you would just go back to Edit, Find, Replace, and say FT as 1, and replace all. And it looks like it worked for us. Okay, so that's pretty easy, pretty straightforward. Again, there is another way to do it with a formula, but it's a bit more complicated, and then you have to basically copy the formula all the way down the sheet. So this is just one way to do it. And for me, it seems to be the easiest. Again, don't forget though to keep your data guide. So I've already messed up, right? I need to write FT is 1. So I need to keep track of that, because it can be really, really easy to lose track of that. So just keep in mind that you do need to keep track of this information. Video, we will be manipulating the data a little bit, and we will be creating what are called new variables. So let me explain just a little bit. As you have seen from class and from working with this data set, you know that we are working with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We're working with 7 behavioral variables for this data set. So for example, engagement would be considered a variable. Now, if you look at the data that you actually have, what you'll actually see is a series of questions that corresponds to this idea of engagement. Here you have a series of questions that deals with this idea of opportunities for growth, right? So you have a series of questions that connect back to these variables of interest, okay? Now, what this is called is, it's called a latent construct. So the latent construct of these 10 questions, the latent construct is opportunities for growth. The latent construct for these 21 questions is engagement, right? So the overall picture of what we're trying to get is engagement. We're measuring that using 21 questions. You might think about this almost like a personality profile or something like that you've taken, or maybe Strengths Finder or one of those sort of things, right? The underlying issue is sort of one thing, your personality. That's just one aspect of it, right? That's one thing, but you're asked a battery of questions to get at that one thing, right? That one thing is called the latent construct. Whoops. And that latent construct is something that can't be measured directly, so we measure it using a series of questions, right? So that's why we do that. Now, what we're interested in when it comes to these numbers is not really how people answered on each individual question. So each individual question here, we're not that interested in how person number 1 answered on all of the individual questions. It is interesting to us for a couple of specific purposes, which we'll talk about later, but by and large, we're really more interested in the overall score that this person got. Now, there's a couple different ways to do this. You'll notice here that there are some participants who don't have complete data, right? You see little holes, little missing pieces all over the place, and that's okay. Often when you have a data set that you're working with, you'll have missing data, and there's a couple different ways that you can handle that. So one way is to actually replace each score with an average score. So this would take some advanced statistical software to do this properly and to not make mistakes. But one thing that you could do is you could say, let's replace this score that's missing with the average of the other scores that this person described, right? So this person, it looks like 4, 4, 4, 4, 4. So we could assume that this person would have scored 4 and 4 and even 4 here. We could assume that. Or we could also say that for this individual question, question number 8, we could take the average score of question number 8 for the entire sample that we have, and we could input that average score there. That's not really my preference. I really don't. I prefer to just leave them alone. But what it does is it can sort of impact the overall score that you get. Okay, so let's look into this. I have done an example for you already in the data set that you have, and I'm going to show you my preferred way of doing this. My preferred way is to use the average score, and you'll see here's an example of why I would prefer to use the average score rather than a total score, a sum score. We could also do that. Okay, you see here that this person, participant number 16, it looks like, something like that, has scored 2 and 2 on these 2 questions that measure turnover. Okay, so the average, of course, is 2. This person, on the other hand, skipped a question, answered 2 on the next question, so their average score is also 2. The other way to do this would be as if we computed total scores, right? So 1 plus 1 is 2, 1 plus 1 is 2, 4 plus 3 is 7, right? So you would go down and compute total scores. Now what would happen in this case is that this person would say 2 plus 2 is 4, but 0 plus 2 is 2. So this person compared to this person is going to have a much lower score. And while that may be true, this person may have skipped that because of some negative thing. It negatively impacts the total score that you could get, right? So as it is now, we're treating these two as equal. So this person gets a 2 and this person gets a 2. If we use total scores, this person would get a 4 and this person would get a 2. And although that's okay, it's okay to do that. My preference is to use the average score instead. Okay, so let me show you how to do that if you're not familiar with how to do that in Excel. We're going to make a new column, so we'll click on the column that comes next. We'll say Insert, and you'll see that it's coded the right color for us already. I'm going to go to this box up here, and I'm going to call it, this is Opportunities for Growth, so I'll call it Opportunities for Growth Average. You could call it whatever you wanted. If you wanted to call it something else, you're welcome to do that. And of course, the way to do an average, we'll use a formula. So =, average. I just start typing average and this pops up for me. So =, average. And then I'm going to take it and select these numbers, just the one row. So the average of column I through R, hit enter, and that's my average. Now, to get this to populate all the way down, I can simply drag this box all the way down. Okay, so that's great. I have my average scores. I just need to do that for the rest of them, right? So what I would do is I would go to my next variable. I would insert another column here, and I would call this engagement average. Okay, so or E or ENG or whatever you want to call it, engagement average. Okay, and I would do the same thing. So =, average, drag that all the way across, hit enter, and that's great. So 4.95, that's pretty high for that person. Drag that all the way down, and I would continue going on and on and on. Okay, just for clarity, what you might want to do is in this column, if you select the column, you can actually then reduce the, oops, I guess it's picking up the text here. You can reduce the decimal, okay? And for me, that's a little bit nicer. So I typically reduce it to about 2. 2 is plenty. It gives you some good granularity on the number itself, but it's not too overwhelming. So I reduce it to 2. I would do the same thing here again. Select the numbers and reduce that down to 2. Okay, so that's what I would do with those. Now the other thing that you might want to do is you may want to then, because we're not necessarily working with all of these numbers, what you may want to do is hide these columns. So it just might be a little bit easier for you to sort of work with this data. So if you just select these columns and go to, let's see if I remember exactly. If you go to Format, Column, Hide, it then hides the columns for you. So they're still there, right? We haven't deleted them. We could delete them, but then it would delete our average here, right? We haven't deleted them, and we can always bring them back just by clicking. Okay, we can always look back and see where they are. But that might just that might help you a little bit to just sort of see everything in a little more simple fashion. So again, I would just select these. I would do Format, Column, Hide. And if you do that, Format, Column, Hide, what you're going to end up doing is you're going to reduce this down to just a few columns that aren't going to go all the way across like this does. So that's one good way to just get a very, very succinct view of the data that you're working with without losing the actual data. So again, you could delete it, but then you would have to compute these scores and then convert them to static text and then delete your columns, and it's just too much of a fuss. So this is one good way to do this. Okay. Now that once you've done this, what I want you to do is I want you to save this file as it is. Okay, so you're going to save the file, and then you're going to save it in a different format. So you're going to have a couple of different file formats here. So we're going to do save as, and I want you to save it as a CSV. A comma delimited file, CSV. Okay, so save it as a comma delimited file. When you do that, it's going to say, hey, this is going to take away some features here. Are you sure you want to do that? And you're going to say yes. So when you hit save, use that already, so we'll replace. This is probably what you'll see. Some features in your workbook might be lost if you save this as a CSV file. Do you want to keep using the format? Yes, I do. Okay, now we're going to use that later, so don't worry about it now. But what you should have at this point, once you're finished, you should have 7 columns, of course, with each corresponding to a single score for each of these variables, and then of course your demographic variables here.